Welcome everybody to our event today, the Internet and Islamophobia. My name is Fahmida Rahman. I'll be chairing this event, and I'm very pleased to be joined by award-winning journalist Faima Bakar, Zahed Amanullah from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Miqdaad Versi from the Muslim Council of Britain. So today's event is part of the WebRoots Democracy Festival, which is marking the end of the organisation after 6.5 amazing years. And I have to say, having been involved in it from the very start, it has been an incredible 6.5 years. If you're following along and wish to tweet about today's discussion, please do so using the hashtag WebRootsFest. And if you're following us on Zoom or Facebook Live, please feel free to send questions throughout, and we'll try to put them through our panellists towards the end. So we'll get straight into it, and I'll start with you, Miqdaad. So you've been leading the way really on rooting out Islamophobia in British media. How do you describe Islamophobia and how prevalent do you think it is?
I think Islamophobia is very prevalent. Whatever avenue you look through which you look at it, whichever polling you look at, it comes across the same. I mean, depending on which polling you look at, between 30 and 40% think that, you know, that they have major issues with Muslims in some way. For example, there's one poll which says that 37% of people in this country would support policies to reduce the number of Muslims in the country. You know, it's crazy. Some of the, I mean, some of those are one-off polls, but if you look at them, there's another poll which says that half the population think Islam is a threat to the British way of life. You know, you look at all of these things together and you think, you know, where are these ideas coming from? And you actually look, even when it comes to young children, right? So 31% of young children in the largest poll ever done of children between the ages of 10 and 14 a couple of years ago said that 31% of them said that Muslims are taking over England. I mean, like, this is young children. They have no, you know, it's not their fault, you know, they're young children. They're between 10 and 14. That's the type of attitudes and the narratives that have been embedded within society, that Muslims are this big threat that they're taking over. And then you look at the other types of ones polling out there, and when you try and look at the idea of Muslims being sexual groomers, Muslims being terrorists, Muslims being, all these tropes about Muslims, which have really gained a really strong foothold within many sections of society, and unfortunately, you know, driven in many places by elements of the media, driven in some places by the way that politicians talk about it. The Cambridge University did a study which showed that the way that Muslims are talked about by politicians and by media drive an atmosphere of hostility, is what they called it, towards Muslims. And other studies at the University of Lancaster, Leicester, and others have said some similar things. So you have this big barrage of things happening, but one of the things that's really important nowadays is obviously online interaction, whether it's through WhatsApp, whether it's through Facebook, whether it's through Twitter. And we've seen so many different, in each of these areas, you see that people are sort of consuming news in different and new ways. When you look at it, in different places, people, we have different stats, but at least half of the population, if not more, will gain their news from WhatsApp. That's one study that was done, that was in India, but I think it's probably going to be similar in other countries as well. Other people can probably attest to some of this. And when you see the role of groups and platforms like Facebook, I mean, they had to apologize for the way that their platform was used in the massacre, in many of the killings in Sri Lanka, for example, and across the globe. Like, when you look at these other platforms which are feeding this, you have to try and understand where is this all coming from. And often the source of some of these things comes from elements of mainstream media, which then get twisted and pushed, and narratives get created. And that's why, whilst when you see the stats of how many people rely on mainstream media or trust mainstream media, the latest polling suggests about 25% trust the journalists, which is really low in a democracy when you want to have a strong media. About 50 to 60% or 60% plus trust newsreaders. So actually broadcasters get more trust. But if you're a print journalist, only a quarter of the population trusts you. And these are the things that drive many of the problems that we face, because some of this stuff is incorrect and lies about Muslims which have been propagated. There's so many examples, like hundreds of examples which I have, which we've sort of collated the Centre for Media Monitoring and the Muslim Council of Britain's work, hundreds of examples of these literally false stories which have been propagated out there. And what you do is you get these far-right actors who take this, they share it, and that becomes a narrative. They have propagated this narrative, and they said, oh look, the Times said Muslims are silent on terrorism on their front page, so that means it must be right. And then they add their own commentary, it then gets viral, it then goes across, it gets twisted, and lots of people start believing this stuff because that's what they read in their social media feed. So I think that Islamophobia is a major problem. I think it's propagated significantly through all these different outlets. And unfortunately, the amount of work that's required is significant to get anywhere in terms of moving the needle, because we have to recognize that actually most people don't care. And that's my biggest worry.
And do you think, sort of, you talked about various different platforms, do you think Islamophobia looks different in all of these different spaces, or do you think it's the same beast essentially?
I think that it definitely has different contours and different approaches. So for example, on broadcast media, I think it's generally less Islamophobia overtly, but there's a lot of subtle Islamophobia in sort of broadcast media. When it comes to print media, it starts becoming more overt because people are willing to be more biased, and they're allowed, regulation gives them greater space to be more biased in the approaches that they take, and then if you go into the social media space, then you have a free-for-all, and it becomes much more hard. But if you actually look at the underlying narratives, the stereotypes, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims hate Jews, Muslim men are all misogynists. All of these things, they might be elements of truth to parts of what they're saying, but the generalized approach that comes out from these stereotype generalizations are hugely damaging, hugely dangerous, and a common theme throughout. But let's just remember some of the worst people that we've talked about. We know, for example, people like Katie Hopkins, right? We know that she was on LBC, on a broadcaster, spouting her hatred, until she ended up saying some really hostile things to Muslims. Then she was off. But then she was on social media for a long time, propagating her hate on she was on the Sun for a long time, propagating her hate in a newspaper and the Mail Online. But then she got pushed into social media, and then even on social media she's now being cut out. But you can see this hierarchy where someone of her hostility towards Muslims has been able to have a not a small platform, a major platform across every element of touching society. It shows how powerful and dangerous this is. And also noting that someone like Stig Abel, he used to be the editor of The Sun when Katie Hopkins was there. He's seen as a liberal, reasonable guy. But he was publishing Katie Hopkins's craziness, her stuff, for example, about refugees being cockroaches and dehumanizing them. He was the editor of The Sun. He's seen as a reasonable, liberal, mainstream figure now, without having even had to apologize or be held to account for publishing this hostility and Islamophobia and racism and disgustingness. And I think that's what the problem I think the biggest problem, whilst Islamophobia is obviously different across all these different forms, is the biggest problem for me is that there is no accountability as a whole, with some exceptions, for Islamophobia across many of mainstream characters, and unfortunately it's become very normalized across society.
So that sort of takes me nicely to the other thing I sort of really wanted to ask you about, and that's this spreadsheet that you've been maintaining. I hear you've recorded every article written about Muslims since 2016. Can you tell us a bit about that and what you've learned from doing that?
Yeah, so in the early days, in the first couple of years, what I used to do was every time any article mentioned Islam or Muslim, I used to recognize, I used to Google search, I used to use the search tools and find out in the last 24 hours or 48 hours who's been writing about Islam or Muslim, look at all of those articles, type them out if they are problematic, and keep them in a spreadsheet to work it out. That was obviously a very time-consuming thing, which had massive impact, I think, in terms of being the basis on which I sort of made lots of complaints and got a lot of articles changed. But what that was, the value of that was creating a base and a methodology which I felt could then be replicated. And from that, we were able to raise some money, and we have now, a Centre for Media Monitoring in the Muslim Council of Britain, where we have tools which automatically collate a lot of these articles which mention Islam and Muslims, and then we have people who sort of allocate these articles and literally go through every single one, not just articles, but also any clip online, and they categorize them based on 10 different metrics, and decide based on those 10 different metrics and in a sort of academically robust way, are they biased or not, are they positive or not, and therefore on a holistic basis. We don't just look at, therefore, those which are inaccurate in a dangerous sense, which we were talking about before. What we are also now looking at is, if you look as a whole across all media mentions of Islam and Muslims, which is where a lot of these things start from, are they generally positive or negative? And are they generally misleading or not? Even because some of these might not break any regulatory rules, but that's not what matters. A lot of the Islamophobia that spreads is not something which is illegal. It's not something which is against the regulation. It's something which is pernicious in its negativity about Muslims. It's something about, if you receive 100 stories about Muslims and you don't know any Muslims, and 99 of them are all negative, that causes a big issue in your psyche about what Muslims are. And I think that's what we've hopefully been able to move from. And then we sort of started doing, in-depth studies on how Muslims are reported when it comes to terrorism, and highlighting examples of newspapers which are worse and better. And we've got many more things coming up. But it's not just about this is all sort of reactive. We also do a lot of proactive stuff now, engaging with managing editors directly, senior producers directly, editors of the BBC and the Times, the Sunday Times, all the Times. And talking to them and trying to hold them to account and bring them into our roundtable discussions to try and improve their reporting on Islam and Muslims when it comes to all these different issues. So it's been a journey from starting from a spreadsheet onto a big, the Centre for Media Monitoring with 3 members of staff and regular roundtables with top journalists across the country, as well as huge seminars, etc., and big reports. But I think that journey has been really valuable, and it's really great to have started literally by Googling names on Google, and now it's a full reporting schedule. So it's a great journey to be part of.
That's really incredible that you've sort of come this far in this journey. I guess the big question then is, have things sort of, in the years that you've been doing this, have you noticed any shift? Have things changed a little bit for the better, or are we sort of moving into a sort of more deeply Islamophobic cesspit?
I think that some things have got better. I have seen slightly fewer, and I mean, you have to be slightly conscious of the wording you use here, slightly fewer overtly inaccurate pieces. Let me give you a couple of, so for example, The Sun had this situation where they said that gunmen shouted Allahu Akbar in a Spanish supermarket, something like that, right? And it was just a made-up art. And what actually ended up happening was a Basque separatist. So they won't speak Arabic, they speak Basque, right? So it was nothing to do with Muslims. And they said it was they said terror attack, gunmen shouting Allahu Akbar into the supermarket. They realized that was a load of rubbish. They changed it to horror. They didn't want to call it terror anymore because it's obviously not Muslim. So they call it horror, and they changed it afterwards to say it was a Basque separatist. Fine. I spoke to them to get that change done. Fine. 2 weeks later, they made a very similar error. Okay, they literally did it. And the problem was that they were citing these Central European news agencies who just literally find pieces of right-wing nonsense and publish it out there on a wire, which people then use. And they have now realized that some of these wires are not reliable. And now, because we called them out when they lied a few times, they're being more careful. So you can see some elements of improvement. I just wanted to use that example to demonstrate that there's tangible improvements, and they're not doing that kind of thing anymore. But at the same time, you still see random lies about sometimes Muslims or ethnic groups or race groups quite regularly. I mean, on the front page of the Telegraph for a lot of the day, just earlier this year, there was a thing saying that 90% of COVID cases come from Pakistan, right? And you're like, we're so spread. And what had happened was that they were talking only about those people who had come in from this country within a 2-week period, and it was basically a massively skewed thing. So factually, you could possibly argue that one element is true, but the headline didn't give that impression at all. And we're going through this whole journey with the press regulator right now to try and get it give them a slap on the wrist, and that's all they're going to get on the back of it. So is it getting better? Yes. Are there still major issues? Unfortunately. And when you have a situation where we have very few Muslims within mainstream media, only 0.4% of journalists, according to one City University says, are Muslim, and if only 0.4% of journalists are Muslim, and Muslims are about 4 to 5% of the population, that's a tenth of what it should be proportionately. And that's a huge issue. And if Muslims aren't on the table, then many of these things sometimes pass. And I've spoken to many Muslim journalists who are, who I know quite well, who have been in a very difficult situation. They don't want to be, and I'm sure Faima probably can speak about it more, but they don't want to be the person who's the Muslim who only talks about Muslim-related issues. They don't want to be the one who's always complaining that you've got it wrong all the time. But at the same time, they're at the table, and therefore there's some sort of level of responsibility that they want to do that. And so, I've had one friend who said they remember being in a situation where everyone was talking about a story about Muslims, and they were, relatively junior, but they were in the editorial room, and they were like, this doesn't sound right. This can't be right. Are you sure? What is it based on? And through them just asking that question, what ended up happening was they realized the story was actually very weak, and they ended up not running it. But that was just because my friend happened to be at the room at the time. And I think that very often we know, and I know someone else who was at the famous 1 in 5 Brit Muslim story on the front page of the Sun, which is in the Times and other places. I know someone who was involved was at one of the newspapers which published that story, and they actually raised it with the editor, saying this is not right, this is misleading, it's not right, it's not how it is. And they got rolled over, and the story still was published, and later they had to retract it. And so what you see is that there is the ability to make a real difference whilst being there. So I'd say things are getting better, but there's a long way to go, and we need, it's about fantastic stories coming out from people like Faima in the Metro and other places, like who when you have more Muslims there, it helps, but it shouldn't be only up to Muslims. This is up to society as a whole to deal with it.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring you, Faima, in next. So you yourself are a journalist at one of the UK's largest online media outlets. So what's your perspective on the media's relationship with Islam?
I think everything that Miqdaad said is pretty much bang on the point. I think the media plays a huge role in perpetuating Islamophobia. And various research shows that the media that we consume shapes our beliefs and our attitudes. And so the media has sort of latched on to unfortunately, the mainstream media has latched on to Islamophobia, and so they perpetuate the myth that Muslim men, for example, are dangerous or bad or predatory, and for Muslim women, they're oppressed and submissive and so on. And you occasionally get news writers that have sort of latched on to, they stoke these tensions by publishing stereotypical content. This is something that Miqdaad has obviously pointed out. They will mention, Muslim where it's not necessary, where it doesn't warrant it, but they'll sort of ignore that when it's a white perpetrator, or if it's like so for example, terrorists who happen to be Muslim, they receive it was not that recent actually, 2 years ago, there was a study that said terrorists who are Muslim receive 357% more press attention, averaging something like 104 more for headlines, whereas where the terrorists religion isn't mentioned, they average about 15 headlines, which is quite a huge difference. And also it's quite ironic considering that even more recent research shows that the majority of terrorists actually tend to be white, not even Muslim. But again, the newsrooms and editors, they play up to this idea of Muslims being inherently very violent. And this is something that we see with other kinds of stories as well, like, for example, grooming gangs, as Miqdaad mentioned, where the perpetrators are Muslim. Again, that's played up. Their religion is mentioned in headlines quite often, even though the religion doesn't have anything to do with it. There's nothing inherently violent about Islam as a religion, and yet we keep seeing those kind of stories being published time and time again. And I've written about this as well, sort of this myth of Muslim grooming gangs. The research shows that statistically it's 90% of white men that are convicted of those kind of sort of sexual offences. And I appreciate that we obviously live in the UK, so there are more white people, but it's interesting that the crimes of these men don't typify white men, or even like the Catholic Church covering up sexual abuse and stuff like that. It doesn't typify white people, but when it's, the crimes of a few Muslim men, suddenly that speaks for the entire Muslim community and it homogenizes them. So yeah, absolutely, the media plays a huge role when it kind of keeps pushing these kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I think you yourself have been subject to quite a lot of Islamophobic abuse, and I'd be interested to hear a bit about your experience of sort of being on the receiving end, particularly as a woman and as a non-hijabi Muslim woman.
Yeah, so whenever, because I'm not a news writer, so I'm a lifestyle writer. So I tend not to cover sort of the newsy hip bits. So what I do in my work, I try to center Muslims in a different sort of way, in sort of investigative long form features, that sort of thing. And whenever I center Muslim people, I get one rhetoric all the time from Islamophobes, and it's always what about the Muslim grooming gangs, as if, like, as I say, the crimes of a few speak for everyone. And it's like, I can't humanize Muslims, I can't celebrate Muslims, I can't even victimize them without someone piping up and just being like, well, Muslim men just rape white girls, they just completely just shut me out, and they don't want to listen to what I've got to say. Even if it's like a completely like happy story about Muslims celebrating Ramadan or something. And for the grooming gang piece that I mentioned earlier, I published that earlier in the year, and I got such a huge torrent of abuse for it. I was getting emails, Facebook messages, Instagram DMs. I started getting death threats and like rape threats, and apparently my address was posted online somewhere, so I had to involve Met Police and call them and give several statements. And that obviously takes up a huge part of my time. I spent a lot of time talking to police, and and that had a huge mental impact on me. This was like at the beginning of the first lockdown, so I remember just being really scared, because what someone said, they've got your address, it's like I live at home with my family, like, God, you just don't know what could happen, especially considering the very real hate that certain individuals have towards Muslims, and the sort of the string of violences that we see against Muslims all the time around the world. It was a very sort of real fear that someone could actually hurt me. In a way, I am quite, obviously I'm not visible, like if you see me on the street, you might not assume that I'm Muslim because I don't wear a headscarf. So, I probably don't get the same amount of, looks or comments or stares that, a visibly Muslim woman might get if she's wearing a burqa or niqab. But at the same time, being a visibly Muslim woman online, there was still that fear. And there is still that fear that someone might recognize me off Twitter or my articles and, get violent with me. So there's definitely that fear. And also interestingly as well, actually, because as I say, I'm a lifestyle writer, so I do the serious stuff, but I also write about fun stuff like sex and dating and relationships. And because certain people see me as like a Muslim ambassador, whatever, because there are so few Muslim writers, sometimes I'll get comments from both sides, from like the Muslim community, who will be like, oh, why are you writing about sex and gay marriage and stuff? And then I'll even get it from like the other side. Like recently I got an email from this white guy, and he was like, oh, if you're Muslim, then why are you writing about sex? That's not very Muslim of you. So it's really strange. And I feel like there's like an attempt to sort of pigeonhole me. Like if I'm going to write about Islam, then I can't write about other things. So it's certainly an interesting experience, being a visibly, a very present Muslim woman online.
Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of hear about the duality of it, the sort of experience of Islamophobia from Islamophobes, but also what you get internally from the sort of Muslim community. That's the last thing I really wanted to ask you is, to what extent do you think the internet and particularly social media itself can fuel Islamophobia, and how does it do that, and how has it sort of affected your experience?
Yeah, so there's many pockets of the internet that can sort of fuel Islamophobia. As we said, mainstream media is definitely one of them, in the headlines that we see, in the kind of stories that get picked up, and also in the imagery that they choose to use. We're seeing this especially now in the pandemic. We saw a lot of images of Muslim communities for COVID stories that didn't necessarily have anything to do with Muslim groups, but again, sort of making those sort of subconscious associations between Muslims and what's going on in the world. So yeah, the mainstream media definitely, but also social media is a huge player as well, especially sort of websites like Reddit. Reddit is a really important one because it sort of prides itself on being a free speech platform, and you've got this real danger of young people especially being potentially radicalized. And I covered this like a year ago or so, the manosphere, which is the an online platform for Muslim, not for men generally to speak about whatever they want. And there's more and more young people, young men especially, getting involved in that. And there's a huge incel culture, which is involuntarily celibate men, who for the most part are, you know, are sort of, they share that philosophy of, you know, hating women, or, you know, they think women owe them sex. But there's also subcultures of, you know, racism, Islamophobia, and all sorts of isms going on, because it's not regulated. So you know, these young people who are very impressionable are, you know, joining these alt-right Islamophobic corners of the internet, and it's unregulated. So they're just completely embroiled in these communities that don't have their ideologies and their thoughts and their speech challenged at all. So it's very easy to build an idea of the world, you know, just to stay in the echo chamber without any sort of outside or different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Just a reminder to anyone listening along, please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we can put them to the panelists later. So that's a really good point to sort of move on to Zahed, who's been looking at this from a global perspective. And I'm aware you've done quite a bit of research on the internet and Islamophobia. Can you tell us a bit about your research?
Sure. I mean, where to start? I mean, first of all, a lot of what Miqdaad and Faima said covers the basis of what we're trying to track online in a very detailed way. We're looking at basically this culture that has come of age in the last 10, 20 years, where it's okay to basically slander Muslims without any consequences. What we're interested in doing is tracking how these phenomenon are amplified and weaponized, frankly, with social media platforms and online in general. And a lot of our research has been looking at extremism writ large, you know, from wherever it comes from, because we see patterns that are very familiar. And when we look at Islamophobia in particular, one of the things that we've been tracking recently in the last few years is how Islamophobia is weaponized in the context of political elections. And you name the country. I did a long research project in Kenya where that was the case, and we've seen it in Sri Lanka, we've seen it in India, and of course in the West, all over Europe and the United States. And we see spikes where, you know, it's one of those tools that gets used because it's so effective and so easy to use without consequence, that you can count on it being implemented the closer you get to an election. And of course, how it's used, it's used in many ways, either to disenfranchise Muslims themselves, or to attack candidates that are standing up for Muslims or sympathetic to Muslims or Muslim themselves. And you know, it's done, of course, on all the platforms we know, because you know, as Miqdaad referred to earlier, you know, we're talking about things that may not be illegal, but certainly do leverage these feelings about Muslims in a way that achieves the aims of those who are implementing those strategies. So one of the things that we've done recently, in addition to tracking how Islamophobia is weaponized in elections, is we've just now finished a project. We're in the final stages of it, working with a whole host of civil society organizations in the US over the past year, particularly Muslim organizations, on how to build resilience and combat Islamophobia, especially when it is used to disenfranchise Muslim voters or Muslim candidates, or activities to support them. And it's been a fascinating process because we're talking about organizations in the US like CARE, MPAC, MGAGE, who have spent many years learning the ropes on how to navigate the political scene, but of course have had to deal with Islamophobia, and mostly online, used to disrupt them. And it filters into the mainstream culture, into the press, and into even Hollywood, even entertainment. You know, all those the Venn diagrams that overlap when it comes to Islamophobia, you know, are incredible to sort of witness. But looking specifically at the election, because I think there's so much to learn there. You know, we looked at it from two ways. One is, how can community organizations, especially Muslim organizations that represent communities or candidates for office, defend themselves effectively against disinformation? And that's, a lot of Islamophobia is rooted in disinformation, that attempts to sort of silence them or cease their activities. And the other thing is, who's amplifying this stuff? You know, a lot of the research that we've done shows that, you know, there is authentic behavior and inauthentic behavior. Inauthentic behavior, of course, is when you have a state or non-state actor come and look at a you know, phenomenon, a trend that's happening online, and they choose to amplify it in ways that are often hard to detect. And we saw evidence of this, for example, in the 2016 election, when state actors like Russia would get involved in the US election, or even here in the UK with Brexit. I mean, there was a case, for example, in 2016 where, you know, Russian trolls, you know, artificially pitted a Muslim organization and a far right organization to get their followers to meet online on the ground and actually, confront each other. I mean, it's really insidious how a player that's relatively anonymous can use Islamophobia to stir up conflict. And of course, this has had deadly aims and deadly consequences in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, as was mentioned before. And earlier this year, when COVID-19 came on the scene, we saw a really concerted effort. We have a report on this, on how the coronavirus was, there was a move to blame Muslims for the spread of coronavirus, the corona jihad phenomenon. And in a place like India, where there's already so much happening against Muslims, and with a government that is openly hostile, this had very serious consequences. And a lot of that, of course, because we're talking about the internet, spread to Hindutva groups in the U.S., who were being openly courted by Trump when Modi visited, and so forth. So I mean, there's, it's the most reliable tool in the toolbox of political actors that want to mobilize followers for political aims. And so we've spent a lot of time this year. A lot of my year has been spent working with these organizations in the U.S. to try to, in anticipation of this. We knew this was going to happen. We knew this was going to be weaponized, and it started out really by what we do is we map trends online, and we do search for the inauthentic amplifiers. Because if you can identify those actors, you could search for ways to marginalize them, either with the cooperation of the social media platforms, or by naming and shaming, frankly, in order to limit their ability to amplify Islamophobic content. And the one thing that I will say that was very interesting about this year is that in the US, and it's probably a byproduct of the Trump era, you had more Muslims running for public office than ever before. And part of the challenge and part of the response to Islamophobia is crafting the narrative, and that involves getting involved in the public space, whether it's in the media, whether it's in journalism, as Faima was mentioning, in mainstream media, or in the political space. And that is probably one of the most effective ways to push back against the impact of Islamophobia as it, and the plausibility of a lot of the disinformation about Muslims that's promoted online. So, it turns out that, now that the elections are over, 57 out of 110 Muslims that ran for state level office and above were elected, including Muslims in very red states. And so I think there's maybe a sliver of good news here as to how we can overcome the very real, spread of Islamophobia, the weaponization of it, by standing up, crafting that new narrative head on, and showing the diversity that exists amongst Muslim populations, that alone dispels a lot of the narratives. And I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. If we can continue to do that, we can limit the way that Islamophobia is weaponized.
So you spoke earlier about sort of in the election, Islamophobia wasn't actually the most prominent sort of campaign out there. Can you tell me a little bit more about the sort of different forces that were at play and how they sort of relate to Islamophobia, or what the sort of commonalities are there, and how we sort of go about tackling sort of these hateful campaigns sort of as a whole, really?
Yeah. Well, we started 2020 with working with a lot of Muslim organizations in the US, feeling that Islamophobia was going to be the key driver used against them, and especially against Muslim candidates running for office. But one of the things that is different this year than it was 2 years ago, 4 years ago, were some very prominent Muslims, of course, elected to Congress. I'm speaking about Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and others. And in the political scene, nothing more in the United States has started to shift the perception of Muslims than the elections of Muslims to federal office in the U.S. And it turned, and of course they were handily reelected, with huge majorities, despite everything. And you've all seen the stuff that's been thrown at them from Trump, especially, and none of it stuck. And I think, again, a sliver of good news here is that when you have that platform and you have that attention, how you use it to push back against Islamophobia can be effective, and especially if it's done in a way that is rooted in social justice, rooted in getting allies to stand alongside us, in defense of Islamophobia. I mean, that's that was true from the day the Muslim ban was put into place. I remember flying into the US the week that Trump was inaugurated to a sea of faces protesting the Muslim ban in Washington. And they were not just Muslims, they were from a whole variety of backgrounds. This is part of the answer. Part of the answer for us to push back against Islamophobia is to make sure that we have those partnerships. And I think that did a lot this election season. There was so much noise in the air about the subversion of democracy, about getting out the vote and so forth, that Islamophobia turned out to be not one of the leading barriers for a lot of the Muslim organizations working in the US. It doesn't mean that Islamophobia wasn't used. In fact, it was used against a lot of mainstream candidates running because they had stood up for Muslims during the Muslim ban and elsewhere. They were the ones who were getting the sort of Islamophobic attacks almost more than the Muslim candidates. I mentioned before that everything that was thrown at Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib didn't stick, so there was a sense there that actually, maybe we can navigate through this. And again, the focus was getting out the Muslim vote. Mgage, one of the organizations leading that charge, got 1 million Muslims to go out and vote in key swing states, and it likely tipped the difference in favor of Biden. And this is despite the Islamophobia that was leveraged against them as an organization. So it's again, that's one side of the equation. The other side is, what do the social media platforms and their role have to do with the way that Islamophobia has been amplified? Just this past week, Senator Dick Durbin rallied 13 of his colleagues to write a letter to Facebook to take anti-Muslim bigotry seriously. This probably wouldn't have happened a couple of weeks ago or even a couple of years ago, but there's a sense now that one of the biggest drivers of Islamophobia, which is President Trump himself, is soon to be out of office, that we can now take this issue seriously. We can have a serious conversation with the social media platforms. We've done it for other similar issues. We did a report on Holocaust denial on Facebook, and Facebook, whether it was because of our reporter or otherwise, did end up changing their policy on Holocaust denial because all the people who were using it to inflame hatred against Jews. So there are precedents being set about how we can start to address Islamophobia on platforms, and we can start to find out where those boundaries are, whether it's rooted in regulation, or it's rooted in the terms of service of these companies themselves. We'll find that, inshallah, we'll find that sort of middle ground, which will at least minimize the way that Islamophobia is used to disenfranchise. And I think that's key. We're not talking about just insulting people. We're talking about disenfranchising, harming communities. Those are real measurable things, and we can, and things like what Miqdaad is doing, building the case for that, building the evidence base for that, is a real key part of the solution. And that's what we're trying to do from an online perspective, showing how things that are amplified and weaponized without being mitigated cause real harm. And so the social media companies will have to answer for this. And so I think we are building that evidence base up collectively, and I think that there's seeing the way that the winds are blowing, the social media companies will have to sort of adapt accordingly.
Yeah, and Arik's asked a question that's sort of quite close to what you were sort of talking about. He asks, what kind of engagement have each of you had or received from social media platforms with regard to tackling Islamophobia as a researcher, as an advocate, or as a victim of Islamophobic abuse? I'm going to go to Faima first with that one, because I think the abuse that you've received has been on social media, so I think it's quite pertinent to sort of start with you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see much engagement from people that are wanting to learn about it, who want to advocate, and fight against Islamophobia. The opposite tends to happen. I think it also has to do a lot with the publication that I work for. I think the demographic is, it's quite, the majority are white, and they haven't had to grapple with a lot of the things that I write about, such as racism and Islamophobia and religion, culture, that sort of thing. So when I write these sorts of things, they think it's very radical or it's completely false, because they've never met anybody, or they don't know anybody that's Muslim, or they've never heard these things ever before. So for them, it's very easy to brush it off as false or fake or whatever. So their very first reaction is, it's resistance, it's denial. And so it's not very often that I get someone who's willing to engage with that sort of content. So unfortunately, it's been a lot of abuse, being ratioed, which is when they just comment like endlessly to try and get you to either like delete your tweet or privatize your account. And that is a successful model. It does work. They will literally just annoy you until you've gotten rid of it. And when I did that grooming gang one, I remember Majid Nawaz is that his name? Yeah, he got involved. I can't believe what his name. He got involved, and obviously he has a huge following. And as soon as he commented, and we all know the kind of figure that he is, as soon as he commented, my tweets just completely blew up. I had to delete it, and then in other instances, I've had to privatize my account because it's relentless. Like, they really want to get under your skin. That's what they just will not let you rest. So unfortunately for me, my experience has been very sour.
Okay, and what about you, Miqdaad? I know you sort of spoke about your engagement with the media, but what about with social media platforms?
So far, my interaction with social media giants has been quite limited. I've tried a little bit and had some response, but as a whole, the appetite seems to be a little bit less than we need. I mean, there's certain things that they can do quite easily if they want to. Firstly, it's very, very clear that on the really dangerous stuff, they could act better, right? I'm talking about the unequivocal hate speech, the unequivocal, when a bomber is going around Christchurch, a shooter going around Christchurch murdering Muslims in a mosque, making sure that that's not streamable on your platform is a relatively straightforward thing to make sure it doesn't happen. I mean, that's like of the worst kind, definitely shouldn't happen. There's lots of other things that they can be doing, right? Let's say, for example, there's a news story that is published on the platform, and the news organization later changes that news story, right? Because they realize it's wrong. In that situation, it's very possible if for that story, which has been shared quite a lot, that link which has been shared quite a lot, Facebook monitors that, or Twitter monitors that. Anyone who's had an impression or has got passed through that article or that tweet which has that fake story, Facebook knows because they monitor impressions. And given that, it's very easy for them to say, this story has now been retracted. They have the ability to make that information known to people, should they choose to do so. They have chosen not to do so. And at the moment, they're taking a very light touch approach to fake news generally, and hate speech in particular, with only, hate speech from a political leader like Trump hardly touched, but fake news from him, at least there are these little, words underneath saying this information is disputed, which is starting to move in the direction that we need to. But when it comes to fake news from, and hate speech in particular, from a large number of other people outside the biggest, most important people in the world, very little is done. And I think that there's a question of resource, which they can put more money to. There's a question of willingness to act, which actually has only been almost with them kicking and screaming, they're sort of coming down to an approach of taking some action. And then there's a question of like genuine accountability. I mean, when people have died in places like Sri Lanka, and they have had to apologize for their role in some of these really quite abhorrent situations. When that is the extent to which things are happening, they need to take greater responsibility, greater accountability, and at the moment, their willingness to engage is quite limited.
And what do you think the role of us as consumers of social media, of media, is in all of this, in sort of pushing social media companies to be more accountable?
It's really tough. I mean, the reality is the power is with the few, not with the many. There are obviously every now and then, when many people, and I mean millions or hundreds of thousands, talk about a certain topic and highlight how awful it has been, that might and that has elicited some sort of action. But when you see that when it comes to the racism of President Trump, whether it comes to, at the biggest levels in some of these social media giants, and the platform that they have been able to give to hate speech. I mean, there's nothing else you can talk about. It's genuine hate speech from main people using platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Unfortunately, there isn't that willingness to act, and I think that despite millions of people speaking out against it, so I think there is some responsibility on us to try and highlight it, and it's important to try and do so and to advocate on behalf of people across the globe. But in reality, it's these top people, the decision makers, who need to be held to account. And sometimes, and I worry about this when this is the only solution, but sometimes it requires politicians to say, and as I had talked about earlier, senators to write to these guys to get them to act, because they don't listen to the random Joe or random Fatima or Muhammad on the street, right? They listen, unfortunately, to those who are able to influence them and make a difference. And my hope is that, and I think Zahed talked about this quite well, in a Biden era, maybe there's going to be a different approach from some of the leaders and decision makers, that some of this stuff just won't get tolerated anymore. And that's the reality. They have the power. And I hope that will change in terms of they will change their attitude, but they have to make that decision, unfortunately. I want us all to I know there's someone saying we do matter. Of course, all of us matter in this, but in terms of the decision making specifically, they have all of the power in this.
So I wanted to bring Zahed in on this question as well, but I also sort of want to put this other question that's come into you from an anonymous attendee. So firstly, they say thank you for a really interesting discussion and the work you're all doing in this area. I think you're all great as well. So they say, Zahed, you spoke about crafting the narrative through media appearances. What balance should be struck in this narrative crafting media work between talking about the extent of Islamophobia versus celebrating the success of integration, celebrating the diversity and nuances of Muslim communities, or other positive messaging? So if you could talk about sort of social media first and then sort of come on to this.
So much of the answer to this question has to do with what's done in public and what's done in private. And I think we tend to, in the past, we've tended to focus a lot on a public reaction, which is fine. And I think we need to invest more in what we can do in private. And by that, I mean, as has been referenced earlier, being at the table where decisions are made. I mentioned Senator Dick Durbin writing this letter and getting his colleagues to sort of join in, talk about anti-Muslim bigotry. His chief of staff is a Muslim. I mean, like, you know, I mean, I meant there was a question about the Biden administration, what they'll do. Engage, which is the organization that was leading the Million Muslim Vote campaign, we had a private call with him with 3,000 Muslims watching, where he promised that he would staff his administration to look like America, which includes Muslim Americans, and would hire Muslim Americans. And sure enough, his transition team has 3 Muslims on it, 2 who served in the Obama administration. So there's a really, you know, I mean, it's starting to look like those promises will be kept, and those very talented individuals will be helping make decisions about these issues from the inside. So we need that combination. We need to be in the boardrooms, in the heart of political power, in the heart of the creative industries, and then of course have the public faces. I mean, Hassan Minhaj just in the last year was doing so much to change the narrative about Muslims before his show sadly got canceled. Just one of many, many people in the public space, you know, who are directly challenging the things that Islamophobia thrives on, and part of this narrative crafting process is sucking the oxygen out of the air that allows Islamophobia to grow. Remember, a lot of these people are filling in vacuums. You know, some are doing it, of course, a lot of them doing it very deliberately. Others are filling in the vacuum with what makes them feel good, or what makes them, you know, make sense of the world. And it's hard, but the more that we can fill in those spaces with voices that are showing the true face of Muslim communities in all their diversity around the world, the better chance that we have of limiting the impact of Islamophobia. It'll always be there, but mitigating it and in a multilateral way is really the way we have to look at this. And there's a part that every different sector and every different person with different talents can do to actually, you know, to be that 1,000 points of light to limit the impact of Islamophobia.
So just bringing Faima in your role as a journalist, I guess you do a lot of this sort of crafting of the narrative, and you're writing sort of positive articles about Muslims, writing about Muslims celebrating during Ramadan. What is your position on sort of the balance in talking about Islamophobia and sort of celebrating successes and diversity?
I think it's important to do both, because, you know, people react differently to both types of stories, and unfortunately, some people will perceive you as constantly banging on about Islamophobia. I've got journalist friends, I've seen people who are constantly, you know, fighting the good fight, speaking up against Islamophobia, but what happens is people get desensitized from that, and they sort of just start ignoring it eventually, because they're like, oh, this person's banging on about the same thing over and over again. So while I do try to report on, like, you know, research that shows prejudice towards Muslims, towards minority groups, I also try to humanize them, as I've said, and celebrate our existence, you know. And sometimes it's also important not to signal, like, not to signpost that it's a Muslim person doing something for the first time, because then we have that sort of model minority myth, you know, where we only celebrate exemplary Muslims, or, you know, an exemplary minority person. So sometimes it's really about, you know, balancing, and I try to, you know, on occasion I'll be like, it's important that a Muslim person has achieved something given the system of oppression that works against them, and other times it's important not to mention their background at all, to show that, you know, especially where it's to do with something that's quintessentially British and so on, because you need to show that Muslims are part of Britain. So you don't need to signal them and be like, oh, look, a Muslim person did this, you know, because why should you would never say a white person did this. So sometimes you need to make it as natural as possible that Muslim people exist, and, you know, they're achieving X, Y, and Z. So it's really about balancing.
I just wanted to move on because we've got about 6 minutes left. There's a lot of interest in the Q&A about the US election. So Majid asks, in your opinion, did unchecked hate speech and Islamophobia on online platforms contribute to Donald Trump's election and increased vote in 2020. He also says, I'm a big fan of all of you and thanks for all you do to tackle Islamophobia. So I'll start with you, Zahed, and then we can go to Miqdaad on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, I mean, in 2016, you know, one of the biggest shocking things that Trump did was to announce a ban on all Muslims entering the country. And, you know, part of it was the shock of it. But then he really went and tried to do it, you know, and did it for you know, for many countries. And it's hard to measure quantitatively what factored into his election and how much Islamophobia was a part of it. But anecdotally, I think it's very clear that it was a huge part of it. And it's not just the Muslim ban, but everything that he has done regarding Ilhan Omar or just, you know, Islamophobia in general throughout his 4 years as president. So I think unquestionably it worked. And again, the reason he did it is it worked in the past. It worked on a smaller scales in the past. We had just never seen a presidential candidate do it.
Miqdaad?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, the number of examples of Trump during the campaign saying something not just slightly but blatantly Islamophobic was quite worrying. I mean, as I had mentioned, you know, the way that he talked about Ilhan Omar basically at every rally he had, talking about how she doesn't love our country, she comes from abroad, she's our secret weapon, and she's basically trying to link her to terrorists and hate. I mean, it's very, very worrying, and the specific focus on firstly the squad as a whole, all four of them as non-white problem characters, and then in particular Ilhan Omar, and probably more than any of the others to some extent, demonstrates the specific extra penalty that Ilhan got because she's a Muslim woman, and her Muslimness was targeted quite clearly and unequivocally. And it's not just what Trump says; it's also what the culture that he's created in the party, where where you can have people like Marjorie Green Taylor, I think her name is,
yeah.
From you know, people who have just virulently anti-Muslim, disgusting racist views, being basically given a free ride because they win in a seat which they you know, Republicans will always win, and they end up becoming a member of Congress. I mean, it's a hateful. It's not just him saying it; it's the culture in the party that has got so bad that level of Islamophobia has actually reached a level by which people are being elected to Congress despite having such hateful views, and I think that is such a problem that it's going to have long-term ramifications for the party in terms of what it's created.
Yeah, and I've had one more question from Tahmid, who asks, how do you reckon Biden's presidency will be for Muslims, or will it be the same old? I think, Zahed, you answered that before, but I wanted to sort of ask that, but along with it, the sort of parallel question about representation. So obviously here in the UK, we've had a lot of or a bit of Muslim representation in Parliament, in the media, on TV, with the likes of Sajid Javid, the likes of Sadiq Khan, and so on. How do you think, as well as sort of Biden's presidency, how do you think sort of having Muslims in positions of power, or people who are sympathetic to the sort of positionality of Muslims and to the role of Islamophobia, how much do you think that actually serves to tackle these issues? Or is it sort of by the by, and when the person's gone, the motive's gone? I'll start with you, Zahed.
Yeah, I think it's important not to get too starry-eyed about being at the table. We had a lot of Muslims in the Obama administration, and while that was light years better than the Trump administration, there's a lot to be critical of. Now, having said that, there's a lot, I mean, having Muslims at high levels, and there were, from State Department, Defense Department, and so forth, doing great work independently of who Obama was, for example. There's, you know, so it greatly outweighs the risk of just getting absorbed into the system and getting becoming one of the cogs that run this huge complex thing called government. There's still your chances may be not 100% of making positive change, but they'll certainly be 0% if you're not there. So I think it's a good thing. It's important. Representation alone is just the first step. It doesn't mean that just having the faces. And I'm sorry, you could look at the Tory government and they always trot out ethnic minorities, but that doesn't change what the government is doing. We need to make sure that the things that we care about on social justice, and again with allies in mind. One of the things that is Miqdaad was mentioning about Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's probably the most anti-Muslim member of Congress, but there's a value of having sunlight on someone like that, because she'll be surrounded by 537 other members of Congress who will have to choose to confront that. And you'll quickly see who the people are that are our allies and the people who are, who are going to not take a stand against some of the things that she does. And that's really important to know, because that evidence can be used against political candidates that are going to perpetuate Islamophobia, and we can try to get our allies to vote them out. So there is a little bit of a benefit of all this stuff coming to the surface, because we can identify where it's coming from, who's supporting it, who's promoting it, and crafting a strategy to conquer it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sort of all of us a little bit can speak to the experience of being in positions where we are the representation. And I think there is a difficulty that each person faces. I think sometimes we often talk about, actually, when people are in positions and they're sort of representing, we talk about the people who are doing it well and the people who are doing it poorly. But actually, one part of the discussion that always gets missed is how difficult it is to advocate for yourself, for your community. And you sort of touched upon it a little bit, Faima, earlier when you mentioned sort of being ratioed or sort of bringing things up with your editors and not being taken seriously or sort of being denied. And I think like we've probably all, I certainly have, like in my day job I work in policy, which I most of the time am the only woman around the table, if not like the only brown person, the only Muslim. And so I think we've got to also recognise that representation is difficult, but it's difficult for us, the representees, as well. I've been told I have to close this up, but I'm gonna give you all a minute to do some closing statements, and if you want to come back on that, so I'll start with you, Miqdaad.
Thank you. I think that when we talk about a lot of the racism and the Islamophobia that we all face and that is prevalent within our society, we have only touched on the surface of its scale. It's what we've talked a lot about here is part of the issue in terms of its prevalence in the media and online. We also have to recognize how it manifests within the structures across society, whether it's in politics, which we've talked a little bit about, but also in public life. As a Muslim, it's harder to get insurance. You pay £1,000 more if your name is Muhammad. You're less likely to get a job because and lots of studies show that. If you're in many of these in criminal justice, you're more likely to be in prison. There are lots of these different areas in socioeconomic status. Muslims are half of Muslims live in the 10% most deprived areas of the UK. So there are structural issues when it comes to Islamophobia. So when we talk about how we're going to challenge it, we're talking about a major issue that won't be able to be resolved quickly, and there's a long way to go. But we have to be hopeful. There's still things that are successful, that have made indents. We've got a long way to go. We need to support those who are able to make a difference.
Thank you. Faima, do you have any sort of closing thoughts or words?
Not really. Other than, I guess, as Muslims, I guess keep applying pressure to the very few that do represent you, journalists, politicians, whoever. Just because a minority is in a position of power doesn't mean they're your friend necessarily. So always keep applying pressure, keep questioning them, and always reconsider the platform that you give them, because not everyone's going to have your best interests. And if you see somewhere an area that lacks representation or people like you, then try and fill it, or try and do something about it, I guess.
And Zahed, you get the last word.
Sure. I mean, we're talking about things like government and the social media platforms and the internet writ large, but really one of the things that every single person can do where they are is to meet people who aren't of your faith and get them to know the real you and the real face of Islam. I mean, one of the things I learned from my mother-in-law is that they moved to a neighborhood that was all white, and they immediately invited everyone in the neighborhood over for food to get to know them. And when an EDL march happened down the street, they all got out in the street literally to sort of protect them. We did the same thing on our street when we moved to where we are and made sure that everyone knew us. And, you know, there's a sense that it makes a difference. And that ripple effect will eventually reach the internet, will eventually reach government, will eventually reach the media. That's one thing that we can all do, that we don't have to have a technical brain or a political brain. Just get people to get to know a Muslim in real life.
And that is a wonderful thought to end this on. So thank you so much for being an excellent panel, and thank you for everyone who's joined and asked questions. I'll let you all sort of get on with your evenings.